Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about England's forgotten family and how they vanished from history that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the heart of Yorkshire, where the moors stretch out like a vast, bruised canvas under a perpetually grey sky, there lie stories the earth itself has tried to forget. These are not the celebrated tales of kings or the triumphant chronicles of glorious battles. They are the whispers absorbed by damp stone and tangled roots, the quiet, corrosive secrets of lives that ended not with a bang, but with a suffocating, final silence. Among these forgotten histories, one name, when unearthed, evokes a particular and ancient dread. It is a name spoken so infrequently that it has almost evaporated from the mists of memory entirely. A name that has become synonymous with a sorrow too deep for words, Blackthornne. To truly understand the tragedy of the Blackthornne family, we must begin our journey not with a birth or a wedding, but with an act of profound and desperate fear, an act committed long after the last Blackthorne had drawn breath. A final horrifying postscript written by those left behind beneath the fractured floorboards of the crumbling St. Giles Parish Church. A small, desolate structure of grey stone that stands sentinel on the edge of the Blackthorne estate lies the family crypt. It is a place untouched by the sun, a subterranean chamber of perpetual dampness and decay, where time is measured not by the clock, but by the slow, rhythmic drip of water seeping through ancient stone. The air itself is a physical presence here, thick, cold, and heavy with the mineral scent of the earth and the cloying sweetness of rot. But something is deeply, unnervingly wrong in this silent, solemn space. Each of the heavy, oak coffins, bearing the tarnished silver crest of the Blackthorne name, is bound shut with thick, rusted iron chains. They are wrapped and padlocked with methodical precision, not to keep opportunistic thieves out, but to keep the silent occupants in. This was no act of random vandalism. It was a deliberate, communal ritual performed by the terrified villagers of a bygone era, their faces illuminated by the flickering, uncertain light of tallow lamps as they worked in the suffocating dark. Their knuckles would have been raw, their breaths turning to mist in the crypt's chill. The only sound, the grating shriek of iron against iron. It was a desperate measure, an act of post-mortem imprisonment born of a fear so absolute that it transcended the finality of death itself. This chilling tableau serves as the only remaining testament to the family's legacy. It is not a monument, but a prison built for the dead. The immediate, horrifying question hangs heavy in the stagnant air. A question that has lingered for centuries. What manner of evil did the Blackthornes carry with them to the grave, that the living felt compelled to chain their very bones, to ensure they would never ever rise again? To begin to answer that question, we must rewind the spool of time back to the late 19th century and travel to the source of this pervasive dread, the Blackthorne homestead itself. The manor was not a home. It was a monument to a slow, creeping decay. A hulking mass of darkened stone erected in the early 1700s that seemed to absorb what little light dared to trespass upon its grounds. It stood in severe isolation, miles from the nearest significant village, flanked on three sides by a dense, ancient wood of gnarled oaks and skeletal yews, local folklore. As meticulously recorded in the private journals of a Reverend Michael Davies in 1882, claimed these woods were a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a profane sanctuary where eyes in the darkness watched the living with a cold and patient hunger. The very atmosphere around the estate felt different, heavy, stagnant, and preternaturally silent. Birds, it was said, rarely sang in the branches of the Blackthornne woods, and the wind, when it stirred, seemed not to whistle, but to whisper fragmented, mournful syllables through the broken teeth of the manor's crumbling eaves. It was a landscape that did not welcome life, but rather seemed to endure it. This isolation was more than just geographical. It was a profound psychological quarantine enforced by generations of fear. The Blackthornne family, for all their inherited wealth and vast tracts of land, were pariahs. The villagers of the nearby hamlet of Oakhaven, a small cluster of cottages huddled together as if for warmth against the oppressive presence on the hill, spoke of the family only when necessary. Their conversations were clipped, their eyes darting away from the direction of the estate as if the mere act of looking could invite misfortune. They were a people steeped in superstition, their lives governed by the turning of the seasons, the planting and the harvest, and the old tales meant to ward off the encroaching evil from the moors. To them, the Blackthornes were not merely reclusive aristocrats, they were the stewards of a blight, the hereditary keepers of a pestilence that had seeped into the very soil of the land. According to parish records, for nearly 2 centuries, no villager would willingly set foot on Blackthorne land after dusk. No child was permitted to wander near the woods, and no member of the Blackthorne family was ever truly welcomed in the village. They were monarchs of a forgotten kingdom, their domain one of moss-covered stone and suffocating silence. Their only subjects the very shadows that seemed to breed in the corners of their halls. Their prison was not built of iron bars, but of folklore, of suspicion, and of the crushing weight of an unspoken, terrible history. But this house was not yet a tomb. In the final, fading years of the 1800s, it was still a home, and within its suffocating embrace, 2 young souls were coming to understand the true and terrible nature of their inheritance. Mary Blackthorne was barely 19, yet she moved through the cavernous, shadowed rooms with the quiet solemnity of a woman who had lived a lifetime of sorrow. There was a porcelain fragility to her appearance, pale, almost translucent skin, delicate features, and deep, stormy grey eyes that seemed to hold the permanent shadow of the moors. But this fragile exterior was a deception. Beneath it lay an unyielding core of iron, a fierce and restless intelligence, and a stubborn refusal to surrender to the creeping despair that had already claimed so many of her kin. She felt the decay of her home as a physical illness, a slow-acting poison in her blood that mirrored the blackening rot in the ancient wood beams above. The oppressive silence of the manor did not bring her peace. It screamed at her, a cacophony of all the secrets it kept. Mary was the family's unwilling historian, the one who saw the cracks not just in the plaster of the walls, but in the very foundation of their reality, her anchor to a world that still felt real, a world beyond the fog and the fear. Was her younger brother, Thomas, at 15. He was a stark contrast to Mary's somber watchfulness. He still possessed a youthful spirit, a burning curiosity that had not yet been entirely extinguished by the oppressive atmosphere of the manor. He found his only refuge in the family's vast, dusty library, losing himself for hours in worn, leather-bound books that spoke of other worlds, of grand adventures and blinding light. He was a boy who dreamt of the sun while living in perpetual twilight. To Mary, his innocence was both a precious, irreplaceable gift and a source of constant, gnawing fear. He was a single, flickering candle in an ocean of darkness, and she felt an overwhelming, desperate need to protect that fragile flame from the encroaching chill she felt in every corner of their lives. For the chill was growing stronger. The signs, once subtle enough to be dismissed as the groans of an old house settling into its foundations, or the tricks of an overwrought imagination, were becoming more frequent, more deliberate. It began with the whispers, faint, sibilant sounds that seemed to come from within the very walls themselves. Always just on the edge of hearing, they would snake through the hallways, almost forming a name, perhaps her name, before dissolving back into the oppressive silence. Then came the shadows, in the periphery of her vision. Mary would catch glimpses of impossible movement in empty corridors, a fleeting darkness that was taller, thinner, and moved faster than any natural shadow ought to. Sometimes, a reflection in a polished mirror or a darkened window pane would show a figure standing just behind her for the briefest fraction of a second, a shape of a man with hollow eyes, before vanishing when she turned. And then there was the cold. This was the most unnerving of all. There were pockets of air in the manor, often in the grand central hallway or on the landing of the main staircase, that held an unnatural, penetrating coldness. It was a dead, stagnant cold that leached the warmth from bone and marrow, a cold that had nothing to do with the outside weather and everything to do with a presence that did not belong. These were the portents, the quiet, gathering breaths before an inevitable, house-shattering scream, and Mary Blackthornne, the unwilling watcher of the shadows, knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that something was terribly wrong. The history buried within the walls of her home was beginning to stir, and she feared that soon, very soon, it would rise to claim the living. The certainty that settled within Mary Blackthornne was not the sharp, sudden shock of a lightning strike, but the slow, creeping cold of a winter frost, seeping into the very marrow of her bones. The house was not merely haunted, it was waiting. And the wait, she would soon discover, was over. The catalyst arrived not as a deafening roar from the shadows, but as a profound and unnerving silence that fell upon the house one bleak October evening. It was a silence defined by a single terrifying absence. Her older sister, Eliza, was gone. Eliza had always been the family's fragile beacon of light, a woman in her late 20s whose quiet grace and gentle spirit seemed to exist in defiance of the manor's oppressive gloom. She was not a fighter like Mary, nor a dreamer like Thomas. She was a survivor, one who had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of their home with a resigned and sorrowful poise. Her disappearance was discovered not with a scream, but with a slow, dawning horror. Her room was untouched, a perfect tableau of a life interrupted. A half-finished book lay open on a bedside table, its pages still holding the faint scent of lavender from her bookmark. Her shawl was draped over a chair, still holding the shape of her shoulders. The window was latched from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no note, no explanation. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the air. A final, silent surrender to the house that had been her cage. The days that followed were a blur of hollow activity. Search parties, composed of grim-faced villagers who kept their distance but could not ignore a vanishing, combed the surrounding woods and moors. Their dogs whined and refused to enter the deepest parts of the forest, their instincts sensing a wrongness that human eyes could not perceive. The search yielded nothing, not a footprint, not a torn piece of fabric, not a single sign of her passage. It was this perfect, inexplicable void that shattered the fragile shell of Mary's stoicism. The grief was a physical weight, but beneath it, A cold, hard anger began to crystallize. The house had taken her sister. The whispers and shadows were no longer passive omens. They were active aggressors, and this act of war demanded a response. This was the moment Mary's quiet observation ended and her desperate quest began. She turned away from the futile searches in the outside world and began her own excavation into the only place the truth could be found, the poisoned heart of her family's past. She sought out the forgotten corners of the manor, the locked chests in the attic, the hidden compartments in the library her father had long forbidden. It was in one such place, a heavy, sea-worn chest tucked away beneath a shroud of dusty canvas, that she found the first key. It was not a single diary, but a collection of them, a layered anthology of sorrow written by the women of the Blackthornne line for over 150 years. Her hands trembled as she opened the first volume, its leather binding cracked and brittle with age. The ink was faded, the handwriting a delicate, spidery script, but the words themselves were a jolt of ice to her soul. An entry from her great-grandmother, dated 1788, read not as a personal reflection, but as a chilling warning. We do not own this land. We are merely its custodians, bound to nurture the soil with our sorrow. There is a treasure buried here, a source of our strength, but the price for its protection is a piece of our own soul, paid by every generation. The words on the page were more than a history. They were an invocation, and as Mary read them, she unknowingly answered a call from the shadows, inviting them to step closer, to recognize her as the next seeker of their secrets. The following nights, the manor began to answer her investigation with a terrifying and escalating pressure. The entity that had once been content with fleeting glimpses and hushed whispers was now asserting its presence with a palpable, malevolent force. This was no longer a haunting, it was a siege. Mary would spend her nights by candlelight in the library, poring over the cryptic texts, her mind a whirlwind of names, dates, and veiled references to rituals of appeasement. And the feeding of the root. The diaries spoke of a symbiotic relationship, a dark pact where the family's prosperity was directly tied to their ability to keep the entity within the manor's walls sated and contained. They were not its masters, they were its keepers, and its food was their fear, their grief, their very sanity. As she delved deeper, the house fought back, and it chose its target with a cruel and strategic precision. Thomas. The boy's innocence, the very quality Mary sought to protect, made him vulnerable. His nights became a theater of torment. He would awaken with violent screams, claiming that his bedsheets had been ripped away by an unseen force, leaving him exposed to a paralyzing cold. On one occasion, Mary rushed into his room to find him huddled in a corner, his face ashen, pointing a trembling finger at the foot of his bed where he swore. A tall woman with hollow eyes and a dress of rotting lace had been watching him, her head cocked at an unnatural angle. The apparition vanished as soon as Mary entered, leaving behind only the lingering scent of damp earth and grey flowers. The pressure on Mary became unbearable. She was fighting a war on two fronts, a battle against the past in the pages of the diaries, and a desperate, real-time struggle to protect her brother from a predator she could not see. Their parents, once the pillars of the household, had completely succumbed. Their mother now wandered the halls, day and night, clutching a silver crucifix, her lips moving in a constant, fragmented prayer to unseen forces that seemed to mock her with silent laughter. Their father, a man once defined by his formidable presence and stern will, had been reduced to a hollow shell. He spent his days in his study, the curtains drawn, staring into the cold, dead hearth, a man trapped in a prison of his own mind. Mary and Thomas were utterly alone. Two children adrift in a decaying vessel, with the storm not on the horizon, but crashing down within the very walls of their home. The house was consuming her family, one by one. Eliza had been taken whole. Her parents were being devoured from the inside out. Mary knew, with a chilling certainty, that she and Thomas were next. The entity in the house was no longer testing the boundaries. It was trying to break through. Mary knew she was out of time. With a frantic energy born of terror and desperation, she turned to the most cryptic and ancient of the journals, one bound in dark, unmarked leather, its pages filled with a coded script that had resisted all her previous attempts at translation. She worked for 2 days and 2 nights without sleep, fueled by black tea and sheer will, cross-referencing symbols with old alchemical texts and obscure local histories. The house groaned and protested around her, the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf, as if the structure itself knew she was on the verge of uncovering its foundational secret. And then, in the dead hour before dawn on the third day, the code broke. The symbols resolved themselves into words, and the words formed a narrative so monstrous it made all the hauntings she had endured seem like mere child's play. The journal, she discovered, belonged to her ancestor, Thomas Blackthornne, the elder. The entries were dated from the mid-1600s, a time when England was being torn apart by civil war, a time of chaos, fear, and brutal uncertainty. He was a man facing ruin, his lands threatened by political rivals, his family on the brink of destitution. In his desperation, he had turned away from the church and sought out a much older, darker power rumored to sleep beneath the moors. The journal described, in agonizing ritualistic detail, a ceremony he performed deep within the ancient woods on the night of a blood-red moon. He had made a pact. He offered his own blood and the blood of all his descendants as an anchor to bind a shadowy, nameless entity to his land. In exchange, the entity would grant the Blackthornne family unparalleled protection, prosperity, and influence. It would destroy their enemies and ensure their legacy. The journal entry ended with a single, triumphant, and utterly damned sentence. I have purchased our future with the price of blood and soil. The house of Blackthornne shall stand forever, for our roots are now fed by a power eternal. The revelation crashed down upon Mary with the force of a physical blow, knocking the very breath from her lungs. She finally understood. The chained coffins, the villagers' fear, the madness, the disappearances. They were not victims of a random, malevolent haunting. They were the architects of it. The curse was not an intruder in their home. It was their home. It was in their blood, in their name, in the very stones of the manor. The prosperity and standing her family had enjoyed for centuries had been a lie, purchased at an unspeakable price. They were not masters of the estate. They were its guilt prisoners. Their lineage, a long line of jailers, tasked with keeping a demon fed and contained. Mary stumbled to a mirror, her own reflection seeming pale and alien in the flickering candlelight. She looked into her own eyes and saw not herself, but the culmination of a 200-year-old sin, the latest link in a chain forged in desperation and arrogance, long before she was ever born. The darkness finally had a name, and that name was Blackthornne. The revelation did not bring the release of understanding. It brought the crushing weight of complicity. Mary stood frozen in the cold, dusty library, the ancient journal feeling like a block of ice in her hands. The knowledge she had so desperately sought was not a weapon she could wield against the darkness. It was a mirror, reflecting an evil that was inextricably part of her own being. For generations, her family had not been the victims of a curse, but its willing jailers, its priests, and its purveyors. The shadows in the halls were not intruders, they were family. Despair, cold and absolute, began to seep into the cracks of her resolve. What hope was there in fighting an enemy that flowed through your own veins? It was in this moment of profound spiritual crisis, as the first grey, hopeless light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows, that the sound of an approaching carriage broke the centuries-old silence of the estate. The sound was so alien, so out of place in their isolated world, that for a moment Mary thought it was another trick of the house, but it was real. A lone, dark carriage, pulled by two black horses, made its way up the winding wheat-choked drive. From it emerged a figure who seemed to belong to another era, a woman, cloaked in dark, practical woolens, her face framed by grey streaked hair pulled back with severe elegance. She carried an air of quiet authority and a weariness in her eyes that spoke of long, difficult journeys. She introduced herself as Eleanora Graves, a historian and a private scholar of what she termed Europe's forgotten folklore and the heresies of bloodlines. Her arrival was no coincidence. For years, she had been tracking the scattered, fearful whispers of the Blackthornne name through obscure historical texts and ecclesiastical records, convinced that their story was more than just a local ghost tale. Eleanora was the embodiment of irrefutable evidence. She was the outside world, breaking through the manor's suffocating quarantine, bringing with her not speculation, but proof. In the grand hall, amidst the decaying tapestries and portraits of her damned ancestors, Eleanora unrolled aged parchments and maps of the estate that predated even Thomas the Elder's pact. These were documents from monastic archives, forgotten historical societies, and private collections. They spoke of the land itself, of a potent, preternatural energy that had long existed beneath the Yorkshire moors. Her research corroborated Mary's discovery, but added a new, terrifying dimension. A pact of this nature, Eleanora explained in a low, measured tone that cut through the room's oppressive silence, is not merely a spiritual contract. It requires a physical anchor, a focal point to channel and contain the entity's power. Your family's journals speak of their strength and protection. Historical accounts from outside your bloodline speak of a different name for it. The Blackthornne sigil. The sigil, she revealed, was a powerful talisman, an artifact imbued with the very essence of the pact, forged in the same ritual that had damned Thomas the Elder. It was the heart of the curse, the object that tethered the entity to their bloodline and to the physical stones of the manor. Destroying it, she theorized, might not kill the entity, but it would sever the ancient bond, effectively starving it of the energy it drew from her family's suffering. For the first time, Mary felt a flicker of something other than despair. Hope. The enemy was no longer an abstract concept woven into her DNA. It was a physical object. It could be found, and it could be broken. Knowledge was one thing, confrontation was another. Armed with Eleanora's maps, which pointed to a hidden structural anomaly in the manor's original blueprints, and Mary's intimate understanding of the house's secrets, the trio, a desperate heir, a terrified boy, and a grim scholar, descended from the relative safety of the library into the cold, waiting depths of the house. Their search led them to the wine cellar, a place of damp stone and the sweet scent of decay, behind a false wall, concealed by centuries of dust and neglect. They found not a door, but a single, large flagstone carved with faint, arcane symbols. It took their combined strength to pry it open, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase that plunged into an abyss of absolute darkness. The air that rose to meet them was ancient and foul, thick with the metallic tang of old blood and the dry, acrid smell of burnt, forgotten herbs. This was a place that had never known sunlight, a place built for secrets and for sacrifice. The staircase opened into a circular chamber, its walls of rough-hewn stone covered in the same disturbing symbols they had seen upstairs. But here they were deeper, more pronounced, stained a dark, permanent brown. In the center of the room stood a massive, unadorned stone altar, its surface scarred with channels designed to carry liquid. This chamber was the manor's true heart, the silent, horrific confession of generations of Blackthornes. The air vibrated with a low, almost subsonic hum, a palpable energy that made the hairs on their arms stand on end and their teeth ache. And there, resting in a shallow depression atop the altar, was the sigil. It was not a grand or ornate object. It was a small, palm-sized emblem crafted from a metal that seemed to drink the lantern light, a metal that was cold and dark and unnaturally heavy. Its shape was that of a thorny, twisted root, coiling in upon itself like a serpent devouring its own tail. As Mary reached out a trembling hand, she could feel its malevolence, a psychic cold that promised nothing but oblivion. It pulsed with a faint, sickly internal light, a rhythm that was horrifyingly, grotesquely, like a beating heart. This was it, the source, the physical manifestation of a family's 200-year-old sin. Eleonora produced a small silver dagger from her bag, its blade etched with protective runes. "This is not a battle of strength, Mary," she whispered, her voice tight with tension. "It is a battle of will. The entity will defend its anchor. Do not falter." As Mary took the dagger, the low hum in the room intensified into a guttural growl. The shadows in the corners of the chamber deepened, stretching and coalescing into a single, towering shape that had no definite form but possessed a terrifying, undeniable presence. The temperature plummeted. The whispers they had heard in the halls returned, but now they were a legion, a chorus of tormented voices screaming threats and promises inside their minds. The entity was awake, and it was furious. Mary felt a wave of absolute terror wash over her, a force that threatened to buckle her knees and stop her heart. But then she looked at Thomas, his face pale with fear, but his eyes fixed on her, filled with a desperate, trusting faith. She thought of Eliza, lost to this darkness. That thought, that love, became a fire in her veins, with a cry that was equal parts grief, rage, and defiance. She raised the dagger high and plunged it into the heart of the sigil. The chamber erupted in a silent, blinding explosion of black light. The sigil did not shatter. It screamed, a soundless, psychic shriek that ripped through their minds, filled with the agony of 1,000 souls. The shadowy form convulsed violently, and the very stones of the chamber shook as unseen forces battled for control. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The sigil cracked, dark fissures spreading across its surface like splintering ice. The sickly light within it sputtered and died, and then it crumbled into a pile of cold, inert dust for a single, blessed moment. There was silence, the oppressive weight that had defined their entire lives. The psychic pressure that had been a constant companion since birth lifted. The air in the chamber grew warmer, lighter. Thomas took a gasping breath, as if breathing freely for the first time. It was the silence of liberation. But the entity, though its anchor to their bloodline was shattered, would not die peacefully. Its final act would not be one of surrender, but of pure, unrestrained, and catastrophic fury. A low groan emanated from the very foundations of the manor above them. A violent tremor threw them to the floor as a roar, this one real and deafeningly loud, tore through the house. The curse was lashing out. It was a wounded, dying beast, destroying its own cage in a final, agonizing tantrum. They scrambled up the stairs, choking on dust and fear, to find the manor in a state of war with itself. Doors were slamming off their hinges, windows shattered inward, spraying glass across the floors. Portraits of their ancestors were ripped from the walls by an unseen force, and spectral, shrieking forms, the echoes of those trapped by the curse, rushed through the hallways in a torrent of despair. The very air crackled with a violent, destructive energy. This was not a haunting. It was an exorcism, and the demon was tearing the body apart as it was being cast out. Miles away, in the hamlet of Oakhaven, villagers were startled from their sleep. They saw a strange, pulsing, dark light erupting from the windows of the Blackthornne manor, a beacon of pure chaos against the night sky. They heard no sound, but according to local accounts recorded decades later, many felt a deep, unsettling tremor in the earth, and a collective, psychic moan that seemed to resonate in the very bones of all who lived there. It was the night, the curse, a legend that had haunted their people for centuries, finally died, and it died screaming. Back in the manor, the trio huddled together in the grand hall as the maelstrom raged around them. It lasted for what felt like an eternity. Then, as the first rays of dawn pierced the broken windows, the violence subsided. A new silence fell, but this was not the watchful, heavy silence of the curse. It was the empty, exhausted silence of its absence. The battle was over. Mary, Thomas, and Eleanora stood shaken but alive, amidst the wreckage of their home and their history. The curse had been broken. But as they looked upon the ruin, they knew that the scars on the stone and on their souls would remain forever. The silence that fell in the wake of the curse's violent death was not one of peace. It was the profound, hollow silence of a battlefield after the fighting has ceased. A silence filled with the ghosts of echoes, thick with the dust of destruction and the weight of survival. In the grey light of a new dawn, the Blackthornne manor stood as a shattered skeleton, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world that no longer feared it. The oppressive, malevolent presence that had been the very atmosphere of the house was gone. But what remained was not tranquility. It was a void, a deep, unnerving emptiness that suggested the problem had not been solved, but merely removed. Victory felt indistinguishable from ruin. As the days bled into weeks, the trio worked to bring a semblance of order to the chaos. But a shared, unspoken dread began to grow between them. It was Eleanora, with a scholar's intuition, who finally gave voice to their fear. "What we did in the cellar," she said one evening, her voice low as they sat by alone. Crackling fire in the one room that remained mostly intact. Felt like severing a limb, not slaying the beast. We broke the chain, but I fear the prisoner it held is still lurking somewhere in the shadows of the land. Her words confirmed the cold knot of doubt in Mary's own heart. The battle had been won, but the war, she suspected, was far from over. The house felt free, but the land itself still held its breath. This terrifying realization spurred a final, desperate search through the wreckage, not for answers about the past, but for a new strategy for the future. It was Thomas who found it. In the floorboards of his parents' ruined bedroom, beneath a heavy, overturned wardrobe, he discovered a loose stone, and beneath the stone, there was not a chamber, but a small, iron-bound chest, sealed not with a lock, but with a complex wax seal bearing a crest they had never seen before, a single, blooming nightshade flower entwined with a thorny branch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved with a preternatural care, was another journal. Its leather was black, supple, and bore no name. The handwriting within was elegant, precise, and belonged to a woman whose very existence had been a secret, Elizabeth Blackthornne, an ancestor from the early 17th century whose name had been systematically erased from every family tree and record. Her writings did not just add to the family's history, they shattered it and rebuilt it into something far more complex, ancient, and tragic. Elizabeth's journal was not the confession of a sinner, but the testament of a guardian. She wrote of a time before the pact, revealing that the Blackthorne family's true ancestral duty was not to wield power, but to serve as custodians, guardians of a powerful, volatile, and neutral earthbound entity that slept beneath the estate. Their role was to maintain a delicate balance through ancient rituals of respect and appeasement, ensuring the entity remained dormant. But Thomas the Elder, her ambitious and foolish younger brother, saw not a sacred duty, but a tool. He did not want to be a keeper, he wanted to be a king. His dark pact was not an act of creation, but an act of desecration. He had not summoned a demon. He had taken a slumbering, primordial power and, through a blasphemous ritual, twisted it, enslaved it, and bound its corrupted form to his own bloodline. The curse was not the entity itself, but the result of its profane imprisonment. The revelation was staggering. They were not the descendants of a master who made a deal with the devil. They were the failed heirs of a sacred trust, their entire history of suffering a consequence of one man's arrogant betrayal. Elizabeth's final entries were not a history. They were a set of instructions, a final, desperate plea across the centuries for her bloodline to restore the balance they had shattered. She wrote of a hidden ritual, not of exorcism or destruction, but of cleansing and renewal. It was a rite of apology to the land, a way to release the entity from the blood pact's chains and guide it back to its slumber, thereby restoring the family to their rightful role as its protectors. The knowledge redefined their entire existence. They were not cursed, they were duty-bound, and their work was not yet done. The final ritual, as described in Elizabeth's clear, steady hand, was one of profound and quiet power. It was not to be performed in a blood-stained cellar, but in the open air, at the very heart of the estate, where 3 ancient oak trees grew in a perfect triangle. It required no sacrifice, only offerings, water from a hidden spring on the property, a branch from the oldest yew tree, and a personal token from the living heirs, signifying their willing acceptance of the guardian's mantle. It was a ceremony of peace, a mending of a wound that had festered for over 2 centuries. As Mary, Thomas, and Eleanor gathered at the appointed spot on a crisp, clear autumn morning, the air itself seemed to still, watching. Mary and Thomas, the last of their line, recited the ancient words Elizabeth had transcribed, words of respect, of sorrow for the betrayal, and of a promise to resume their sacred watch. They placed their offerings upon a flat, moss-covered stone at the center of the oaks. As the final word left Mary's lips, there was no explosion, no violent outburst. Instead, a gentle breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and blooming heather. A faint, golden light seemed to rise from the ground, bathing the manor in a warm, forgiving glow for a fleeting moment before fading. A sense of profound peace settled over the land, a tranquility so deep and absolute that it felt like the earth itself had finally exhaled a breath it had been holding for centuries. The house was no longer empty. It was simply quiet. The duty was fulfilled. In the years that followed, the fate of the last Blackthornes was one of quiet, deliberate obscurity. Eleanor Graves, her part in the story complete, departed as mysteriously as she had arrived, leaving behind her knowledge and her respect. She would go on to write several respected, if esoteric, historical texts, but she never once mentioned the Blackthornne name in print. It was a secret she would take to her grave. As for the lingering mysteries, some were never to be solved. The body of Eliza Blackthornne was never found. Perhaps she was the curse's final, tragic price, a soul required to balance the scales before the breaking of the sigil. Her absence would remain a permanent, silent scar on Mary and Thomas's hearts. The question of the entity also lingered. They had not destroyed it. They had freed it. They were its guardians now, and their peace depended on their vigilance. The haunting legacy of their family was not one of suffering, but of an eternal, lonely watch. And so, the House of Blackthornne, having finally reclaimed its true purpose, began its final, chosen disappearance. Mary and Thomas methodically sold off their distant holdings, severing their financial ties to the outside world. They lived out their days in the slowly healing manor, two solitary figures maintaining a silent vigil. They had no children. The bloodline and the terrible knowledge it carried would end with them when they passed. The manor was left to the wind and the rain, its gardens slowly reclaimed by the wild beauty of the moors, its story dissolving from memory into folklore, and from folklore into nothing at all. They had vanished from history, not as victims of a curse, but as a final, successful act of guardianship. What, then, is the legacy of a story that ends in silence? The tale of the Blackthornne family is a chilling reminder that the darkest parts of history are often not the monsters we invent, but the choices we ourselves make. Thomas the Elder's pact was born of a very human desire, the desire for power, for security, for a legacy. He sought to conquer the forces of nature and history, and in doing so, condemned his entire lineage to be imprisoned by them. The true curse that plagued his family was not a shadowy entity from beyond, but the corrosive secret of his own ambition, a secret that festered in silence for generations. His story stands in stark contrast to that of his sister, Elizabeth, a guardian who understood that true strength lies not in control, but in respect and balance. History, it seems, is never truly dead. It is merely dormant, buried in forgotten journals and sealed behind the false walls of our own denial. The Blackthornne story is over. But the profound silence that follows their departure begs one final, unsettling question. What ancient pacts and forgotten duties lie sleeping beneath the foundations of our own world? And who are the guardians that we, in our modern ambition, have long since forgotten?